I may get a few things wrong in this video. It's completely unscripted, so I'm sorry if there's some info missing or just flat out wrong. Thank you, and enjoy. Hey, what's up, babe? You can't sleep? That's gonna be a problem. Can't sleep, then you won't be able to go to work or tomorrow. You won't be able to attend your classes. What if I ramble to you? Just kind of info dump? Maybe that'll help. Yeah? Okay. What I'm really knowledgeable about is Nintendo handhelds. Yeah, it's kind of weird, I know. But the first ever gaming handheld by Nintendo was the Game & Watch, and the main guy behind it, main designer and stuff, was Gunpei Yokoi. And he was, I actually don't know if this was him, but he was like sitting on a train on his way home, way to work or way home from work, and he saw a guy playing on his watch, just a bored business guy, and he was like, what if I made like a game that was also a watch? So he made the Game & Watch, and the first ever one was just Ball. It was called Ball, and basically you just juggle balls. Kind of weird, I know. And then there were 7 different versions. There was Donkey Kong. They made Donkey Kong into a Game & Watch. It was like it's a completely different game though. It was just called Donkey Kong. It was similar to the arcade, but it was a different game. And that was a really big success. And what's crazy about the Game & Watch is that this was before the NES. Each Game & Watch was its own game. There wasn't any cartridges. And it was the first ever Nintendo system to feature the plus control pad, or the D-pad. In 1989, they came out with the Game Boy. Now, the Game Boy was pretty innovative for the time. And fun fact, the Nintendo Game Boy is actually more powerful than the computers they used to take the first man up to the moon. That's kind of crazy, right? It didn't have a color screen. It was in black and white, but it was more like a 4 shades of really ugly green. And it released with the game Tetris. And I am fairly certain you know Tetris, right? I don't need to explain it to you. And the Game Boy was a really big success. Like a really, really big success. I highly doubt anyone wouldn't know the Game Boy. And later, the Game Boy had a really, really long lifespan. It was like discontinued in like 2003, I want to say. Something absurd like that. And it had many iterations. Later came the Game Boy Pocket, which was a smaller version of the Game Boy. And it had an actual black and white screen, unlike the color, unlike the green colored. It was actually black and white. And it was a lot smaller. It took less batteries. It took 2 AA batteries, as the original took like 4. It actually might have been AAA batteries on the Game Boy Pocket. Not 100% sure. Some noteworthy games that came out on the Game Boy are The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. Is that it? Yes. And that one is really, really weird. The whole game is like just really trippy. Link wakes up on like a weird island, and there's like Mario enemies on it. It's just plain weird. But I really like the game. Another big hit of the Game Boy was Super Mario Land, and it got a ton of sequels on the Game Boy. There was Super Mario Land 2, 6 golden coins. Super Mario Land 3, which I think that one was Wario Land. And then Wario Land got its own set of sequels. So there was Wario Land 2 and Wario Land 3. Pretty crazy. And of course, Pokemon. One of the highest selling video games of all time, Pokemon. Pokemon was just a sensation, back in the 90s. I think about the original Pokemon, I'm talking about Red and Green, is that the Pokemon were just freaking ugly. They were really ugly. They're nothing like they are today. Like the original 150, the original design for those were like really, really ugly. And originally they were gonna come out with a 32-bit Game Boy, mid-90s, but it got canceled, and they chose to release the Game Boy Color instead, which was a slightly more powerful Game Boy, but it was color. Now, I think I forgot to mention, the Game Boy didn't have a backlight. The Game Boy Color doesn't have a backlight either, but it can actually show colors now. So there's very colorful games. What's interesting about the Game Boy Color is, like, unlike other, like, upgraded versions of, like, other systems, it had, like, it's all sorts of, like, exclusive games. Like, imagine if, I don't know, the PlayStation 4 Pro had exclusive games that you can't play on the original PlayStation 4. That's kind of unheard of. The only the other console that I know does that is the Nintendo DSi and the Nintendo 3DS, but I'm gonna add it myself. Yeah, all sorts of exclusive games. Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening DX was one of them, which is just Link's Awakening but enhanced to be in color, which is really cool. What I found weird about Link's Awakening DX, though, is that you could play it on the original Game Boy, too. It's just weird. Next, we have the Game Boy Advance. Now, the Game Boy Advance was a 32-bit system, like the planned other Game Boy that was going to release in the mid-90s, but was canceled. Now, the Game Boy Advance, it had two sets of shoulder buttons, which was like the Super Nintendo. But it didn't have an Y and X buttons. It still had the B and A buttons, but it didn't have Y and X. I don't know why. The screen was a little wider, and the sound was a lot more capable, because it's 32-bit. And what's cool is that it was backwards compatible with the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color. So you can play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games on the Game Boy Advance. What's interesting is that the Game Boy Advance had like a completely different architecture than the Game Boy, than the original Game Boy and the Game Boy Color. So what they did is they had like original Game Boy parts inside the Game Boy Advance, which is kind of cool. The Game Boy Advance still did not have a backlight screen. Did I mention that? I don't think I mentioned that. Yeah, it still didn't have a backlight screen, which was kind of weird. And it took 2 AA batteries, so it was a lot more energy efficient than the original Game Boy. Some notable games. Mother 3. I love that game. It's one of my favorite games of all time. WarioWare, such a weird concept. Micro games, really weird. A lot of the Mario games were just remakes. Not remakes, just like ports of older Mario games. Super Mario Bros. 2, the remake of Super Mario Bros. 2 on the Super Nintendo got ported. Super Mario World, Yoshi's Island, all these older games. Kind of weird, in my opinion. The Game Boy Advance cartridges were actually smaller than the original Game Boys, if you pay attention. So the Game Boy cartridges would like stick out of the Game Boy Advance, which I'm not a very big fan of. It looks pretty funky to me. Nintendo later released a enhanced version of the Game Boy Advance called the Game Boy Advance SP. What SP stands for? Special, apparently. And for the first time ever, really innovative stuff, guys. Backlit screen. You can play the game in the dark. Now, I believe in Japan they had something called the Game Boy Light. It was basically the original Game Boy, but you can play it in the dark. It had a backlit screen. But that wasn't released in the United States. Or, actually, it wasn't released, outside of Japan, at all. Now, the Game Boy Advance SP was a clamshell design, kind of like the Nintendo DS. On the top, we had the screen, and on the bottom, there were the controls. I'm not really a big fan of the shoulder buttons on the Game Boy Advance SP. I feel like they're tiny little tic-tacs. I'm not a very big fan of them. Another big thing about the Game Boy Advance SP is that it was rechargeable. You don't have to get batteries for it. You could just charge it, which was pretty cool. Had no headphone jack. You had to get like an adapter for it. Be Apple to the punch, I guess. Next up, in 2004, surprisingly early, in my opinion, for a new console. Between the Game Boy Advance and this one, the Nintendo DS. Yeah, 2004. November of 2004 to be specific, which was 3 months before I was born. I know some of you feel old right now. Anyways, the Nintendo DS was a fucking revolutionary console. It had a touch screen. It had 2 screens. It was foldable. Actually, I have one right here. Where is it? I have the original. It's somewhere. I don't know where it is. Okay, I'm just gonna use this one. I have multiple DSs. And it was foldable. And like the Game Boy Advance SP. And it had 2 screens. One top, one on the bottom. Bottom one was touchscreen. And it used a stylus. I don't have mine. Face buttons, Y, X, are now here. So, yeah, I'm happy about that. First ever Nintendo DS was fat. It was humongous. It was really fat. And I think what happened was they had trouble fitting all the compartments in it. The original Nintendo DS, I just think it's kind of ugly, to be honest. But the Nintendo DS could do 3D games. Now, of course, this was, PlayStation 1 graphics, N64 wasn't very good. But, 3D games. Hooray. And at the time, they were competing with the PSP, which could do, PS2 level graphics, which is kind of insane back then. But the Nintendo DS, had a touchscreen, and everybody wanted it. Everyone in the entire universe, and it sold ridiculously well. The Nintendo DS had a Game Boy Advance slot in the bottom, so it took Nintendo DS games and Game Boy Advance games. You could not, however, play original Game Boy games. And around the same time, they released the Game Boy Micro, which had a backlit screen, and it was a Game Boy Advance, but super tiny. Now, the Game Boy Micro only took Game Boy Advance games. It did not take regular Game Boy games, which makes me ask, why didn't they call it the Game Boy Advance Micro? Just a question. Now, the Game Boy Micro had interchangeable faceplates, which is a really interesting idea. I kind of like it. But the Game Boy Micro is stupid. I'm just gonna say it. It was really stupid. It used its own charging cable. That wasn't like the Nintendo DS or the Game Boy Advance SP, which used the same charging cable, by the way. Now next, we have the Nintendo DS Lite, which changed a few things. It just made the original DS just a lot better. The DS Lite was just slimmer, it was cooler, it was a lot more lightweight, and it it didn't look weird. They trimmed a lot of the fat, literally. And, I think the buttons were a lot more comfortable than the original DS's. I do. It also still had, of course, the Game Boy Advance port. But when you put in Game Boy Advance games, they would like stick out from the bottom. And it was weird. What's cool about the Nintendo DS is that it is the first Nintendo handheld to be able to connect to the internet. So you can play games around the world with your friends. And yeah, that's pretty cool. The Nintendo DS Lite came with its own little to protect the Game Boy Advance slot. The Nintendo DS launched with Super Mario 64 DS, which is a crazy game. I found it weird to control, since the DS only has a D-pad. Super Mario 64 was not designed for a D-pad. It was designed for, a joystick. It was on the Nintendo 64. So they had to work around it. I'm not a very big fan of the game, personally. But a lot of people really like. Next up, the Nintendo DSi. The Nintendo DSi had a camera, hence the eye, because it has an eye. And it was a lot more powerful than the original Nintendo DS. The Nintendo DSi had a SD card slot too, so you could upload your photos you taken with the Nintendo DSi to your computer. You also upload your photos to Facebook or whatever social media from the Nintendo DSi itself, which is pretty cool. It also had its own app store, channel store, like the Wii. So you could connect to the internet and download like games, DSiWare, I believe they called it, and play like really simple little games that you downloaded. Now, after the DS line of systems came the 3DS. The 3DS was a more powerful, much more powerful DS. It could do like GameCube, PlayStation 2 level graphics. Now the 3DS had a stereoscopic 3D screen, meaning it would give the illusion that things were like popping out of the screen. 3D was really popular at the time. I remember my grandfather was all about the 3D, and he got like a 3D TV and like a 3D Blu-ray player, and we never used it. But I absolutely loved my 3DS, and I remember playing Super Mario 3D Land like all the time. One of the unique things I really liked about the 3DS was the Street Pass. And honestly, I can't really explain how it works. But I think you would like pass people by the street, and like it would, if they had like a 3DS and you had a 3DS, it would like know, and then they would appear in the game and they would like give you like items. It works differently for each and every game, but it was really cool idea. and I really liked it. Tons of memories with the 3DS. I love the 3DS, man. One of my favorite games on the 3DS was Luigi's Mansion. I love that game. The 3DS also had something called a circle pad, and it was basically like a joystick, but it was like flat. So that way it could fit inside the closed 3DS. Later, they released the Nintendo 3DS XL, and the 3DS XL was just a larger 3DS. It was just larger. After that came the 2DS, which would move like the hinges, so you couldn't fold it anymore. And it had like this weird door-stop wedge design, and at first, when I saw it, I thought it was just weird. It removed the 3D effect off of it too. So it was basically a version of the 3DS that was cheaper and a lot more kid-friendly, I guess. A game that I really like on the 3DS was The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds. I love that game. The next is the new Nintendo 3DS XL and the new Nintendo 3DS, which is a more powerful version of the Nintendo 3DS, and it had like a second circles pad, but it was like digital. It knew how you were like moving your thumb on it. It was a little funny. It also had 2 more shoulder buttons, so it had a ZL and ZR buttons, which is pretty cool. The new 3DS had some exclusive games. Minecraft, new Nintendo 3DS edition, came out, and honestly, it's such a late 3DS game. I don't know, like, what's the point? The Nintendo Switch is already out at that point. It was just kind of weird, you know? It looks like you're asleep. Good night. Sleep tight. Don't let the bed bugs bite.